And our own Dr. Joe Salerno summarized Mises' view a couple of years ago in really a seminal paper called Mises on Nationalism, the Right of Self-Determination, and the Problems of Immigration. Now, Joe is going to reprise this paper at the upcoming Students for Liberty conference happening in Washington, D.C., just 1 week from today. So we thought you'd enjoy a conversation about Mises and his view on nationalism between myself and Dr. Salerno that we taped a year or so ago. So stay tuned.
So a few months ago, I went to LibertyCon 2019, hosted by Students for Liberty, and one of the speakers there was Joseph Salerno of the Mises Institute. Professor Salerno was giving the case for Ludwig von Mises, the Austrian economist and classical liberal thinker, his perspectives on nationalism and immigration. Now, both of these are related, and the question of nationalism as far as Mises' perspectives go is a very important one. It relates directly into immigration, but I think that I'm going to focus solely for the sake of this video on the perspectives of Mises as far as immigration policy goes and what I think he would have implemented if he had the chance to be in government. So I want to point out at the beginning that I don't necessarily have an ideal of what I think immigration policy should be, nor do I have an ideal of what nationalism is in itself. But what I do think is that there is a right and wrong answer to what Mises believed about immigration. And that's what I'm addressing here. I'm not addressing what immigration policy should be implemented, but what I'm arguing is what I believe Mises believed and what immigration policy he would implement. That's purely what's up for discussion here. My views about immigration are completely irrelevant. Just like Salerno points out in his own article, his point of view of immigration is irrelevant to the topic. So that's the sort of domain I'm working in here. That being said, Salerno's talk was mostly based on an article that he had written a few years earlier in 2017. And it's a very well-written piece, and it's pretty lengthy, so I will link it down, and hopefully all of you will check it out. My response to it is also linked in the description. So the piece is called Mises on Nationalism, the Right of Self-Determination, and the Problem of Immigration. So after hearing Salerno's talk at the conference, I decided to afterwards speak to him, and we had a productive conversation, and I realized how much I didn't know about Mises, and he pointed me in the direction of some works I could look at. So I came to my own conclusions based on looking at these works over the past few months, and I want to illustrate them in the video provided. Considering the fact that immigration is a hot topic in the news today, and libertarians and classical liberals are pretty split on the issue, depending on what circles you hang out in. So the Libertarian Party itself does not support classifying undocumented immigrants as criminals, but this steers many away from the party, and I can understand that. Some libertarians support fully open borders. Some believe that the wall is a necessary thing, and this depends on what perspective you're coming from. There is disagreement as well as to what Mises' views would have been. For example, Lew Rockwell of the Mises Institute says, quote, "The open border rights cannot claim Mises as one of their own," unquote. So is Rockwell correct in this? And he's basing this on the Salerno piece. So is the analysis correct, and is Rockwell's conclusion correct? And I'm hoping to weigh in on this. So Ludwig von Mises discusses his philosophy at length in his book Liberalism, the Classical Tradition. This came out in the 1920s. He looks at immigration as sort of an economic and social phenomena. So some argue that freedom of movement across national lines leads to economic struggles, lower wages, a drain on resources, etc. Mises had a quite crisp and simple answer to these arguments. So he says, quote, "Thus the effects of restricting the freedom of movement are just the same as those of a protective tariff. Looking at it from a standpoint of humanity, the result is a lowering of the productivity of human labor, a reduction in the supply of goods at the disposal of mankind. Attempts to justify on economic grounds the policy of restricting immigration are therefore doomed from the outset," unquote. So it is entirely fair to point out that Mises was writing this before the modern welfare state. The welfare system is a common reason why a lot of libertarians and conservatives oppose open borders. So would Mises adjust his position today? So I think it's important to point out that Mises did live through the first implementations of Keynesian economics and the massive welfare state. So we can look at what Mises wrote back then and see if he adjusted his position. So in 1935, in the midst of the Great Depression, Mises wrote an article called "The Freedom of Movement, an International Problem." So during this time, Keynesian economic theories reigned supreme and justified some of the earliest welfare policies. Mises continued his fight for open immigration in spite of the implementation of the New Deal programs in the United States and similar programs across the world. In this piece, he calls on all nations to break down their travel barriers to avoid social violence. Mises viewed open borders as both a moral imperative and a pragmatic policy proposal. So, quote, "These people will certainly still have just as much cause to complain as before, not over the unequal distribution of raw materials, but over the erection of migration barriers around the lands with more favorable conditions of production. It may be that one day they will reach the conclusion that only weapons can change this unsatisfactory situation. This is not a problem of raw materials. This is a problem of the right of immigration into the largest and most productive lands, the climates of which are suitable for white European workers. Without the reestablishment of freedom of migration throughout the world, there can be no lasting peace," unquote. Now, things become more complicated when we start talking about the social parts of this issue. So many point out that the apparent negative effects of open borders that Mises foresaw. So, according to liberalism, quote, "In the absence of any migration barriers whatsoever, vast hordes of immigrants from the comparatively overpopulated areas of Europe would, it is maintained, inundate Australia and America. They would come in such great numbers that it would no longer be possible to count on their assimilation," unquote. So Mises explains that this is a danger because, quote, "To be a member of a national minority always means that one is a second-class citizen," unquote. Mises says that those who do not speak the native language will be left out of the political process, right? So thus the majority can inflict their will upon the minority. Many conclude that Mises would support tight immigration restrictions for this reason, but is this the correct conclusion to come to? So in liberalism, Mises does not exactly directly state what immigration policies should be implemented in the face of these social problems, but he lays out his general philosophy for us. So, referring back to liberalism, quote, "The chauvinistic nationalists who maintain that irreconcilable conflicts of interests exist among the various nations and who seek the adoption of policy aimed at securing, by force if need be, the supremacy of their own nation over all others, are generally most emphatic in insisting on the necessity and utility of internal national unity. Now, this demand for domestic unity the liberal by no means opposes. On the contrary, the demand for peace within each nation was itself an outcome of liberal thinking," unquote. So in other words, what brought about peace and tranquility in the modern nations was not legislation, but the adoption of liberal ideals, liberal ideas in the classical sense. He demonstrates this again in his argument against the, quote, "fire and sword," unquote, of colonialism. So colonialism, quote, "If, as we believe, European civilization really is superior to that of primitive tribes of Africa or to the civilizations of Asia, estimable though the latter may be in their own way, it should be able to prove its superiority by inspiring those people to adopt it of their own accord. Could there be a more doleful proof of the sterility of European civilization than that it can be spread by no other means than the fire and sword," unquote. He points out some social problems open borders might reap, yes, but he also lays out the catastrophic consequences of keeping them closed. Quote, "As long as nations cling to protective tariffs, immigration barriers, compulsory education, interventionism, statism, new conflicts capable of breaking out at any time into open warfare will continually arise to plague mankind," unquote. So I think it's for these reasons it is highly doubtful Mises would ever support immigration restrictions. Mises sought furthering the well-being of all the world, what he called the cosmopolitan. This included a free economy, limited government, the right of self-determination, and the freedom of movement. So the classical liberal recognizes the inability of the state to maintain peace. So we must ask ourselves whether we should pursue the peaceful way of the cosmopolitan or the, quote, "fire and sword," unquote. So that's sort of my analysis of this, and I'm interested in getting some feedback on this. I'm always looking to look into further writings. If there's anything by Mises I'm missing here, I'd like to be referenced to it. I'm always down to read some more of his stuff. So if you made it through this, thank you for listening. I really appreciate it.